right, we're going to go ahead and get started with week 1 of our Sermon on the Mount series, and we are thankful that out of all the things you could have given up for Lent, you did not give up adult ed. So thank you for still being here. As a reminder, this and all our other classes can be found online on our YouTube channel, Fourth Presbyterian. Make sure it's Fourth Presbyterian Chicago, or you might be very confused. All right, without much else, I will hand it over to Pastor Matt to get us started.
Thank you so much, Justin. Really appreciate it. So good morning, everyone. It is great to be with all of you. Do want to say a word of welcome to all those who are joining us online as well. For those who are joining us online, please know that if you go to the Adult Ed page on our website, you can find the handout available there, and we'll also try to eventually link that into the chat description as well. But hope you all have the handout. But before we begin, I'd love to open us with a word of prayer as well. So let us pray. Holy and loving God, at the outset of this Lenten journey, just lift up a prayer that you would help to open our ears, open our hearts, and open our minds, that we might better hear your word to us, your living word that continues to inspire and guide us, and pray that that guidance continues with every step that we take. So we lift up all of this in Christ's holy name. Amen. So this is the first Sunday in Lent, as Justin shared, and it's a perfect time, from my perspective, to be digging into one of the most absolutely foundational teachings that Jesus ever gave in the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know about many of you, but I have found myself over the weeks and months feeling like I am losing hope a lot these days. I don't know if that is something that you experience. I also have been feeling like what I have to give, is that really enough to make a difference in this world? And this has been swirling in me for quite some time. And as I was preparing for this class, as I was reading through the Sermon on the Mount again, I found myself being inspired and hopeful in a way that I have not been in quite some time. And so from the outset, I just want to say, I hope that you feel even just a little part of that today, or throughout the course of this series. Jesus' words truly are God's living word, and to me, I was astounded at how much it has to say to us today. From the outset, and as we think about the Sermon on the Mount in a zoomed out way, the Sermon on the Mount really is a deliberate reframing of how we are called to see other people, how we're called to act and speak and just be in this world. And again, as I said, it really does feel just as relevant today as it did 2,000 years ago. Throughout the course of this series, both today and in our future courses, I do want to point you to a couple of books that if you're looking for some Lenten reading over these next 40 days, I would highly recommend to you. At the bottom of that first page, you'll see a bibliography. The first is the Gospel of Matthew. I'm in particular leaning on Volume 1 because that's where the Sermon on the Mount falls, written by a Scottish author, William Barclay. If you're not familiar with Barclay, he was both a minister and a professor who really was interested in making biblical scholarship accessible. If you have ever wanted to dip your toes into the world of biblical scholarship, he's a wonderful place to start. So we'll be spending a little bit of time with him. But another, and this was actually the inspiration for this course series, I was fortunate enough to just stumble upon this on a bookshelf upstairs here at the church and found myself really moved. It's called Following the Call, Living the Sermon on the Mount Together. It is an anthology collection of many different spiritual writers and authors, quotations from which you will see quite a bit in your handouts. I found this to be remarkably moving. Was put together by Charles Moore of a community known as Bruderhof community, a sort of intentional Christian community that is interesting in and of its own right. But Charles Moore stitched together all of these different reflections from people and places throughout Christian history. It's a remarkable resource. So wanted to pass all those along to you. But let's get into the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount refers to a particular set of chapters from Matthew's Gospel, the 5th through the 7th chapter, that essentially marks the beginning of Jesus' public preaching and teaching. He speaks earlier as he is baptized, but for the most part, this is sort of his primary introduction to us and comes right on the heels of calling the disciples. So this is in many ways some of the foundational work that Jesus is laying out of what it means to be a disciple and to follow him. Now, one of the things that has been intriguing over time is that there is this gigantic block of text that's 3 chapters long, much of which you can find throughout the Gospel of Luke as well, but in many different places. Now, if you see here, the chapters, even just from this first section of Matthew's Gospel, appear in 5 different places, 5 different chapters throughout Luke's Gospel. And so you might be tempted to ask yourself, why is that? Why did Luke chop up this perfectly good sermon into pieces and spread it throughout the Gospel? What many scholars believe is that Matthew, throughout his Gospel, is sometimes known as the great combiner. He takes material that was separate and puts them together in thoughtful and interesting ways throughout his gospel. In fact, as we will touch on in just a second, one of the reasons that he assembles these sort of long discourses from Jesus is that he's creating 5 of them total, in some ways meant to invoke the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch or Torah, calling to mind Moses. In some ways, what Matthew is trying to represent in these early pages is that Jesus is, we could call him a new Moses, or a reframing of the law that Moses came to bring. That what Jesus is doing here, and what Matthew is representing him as doing, is taking that law that was handing down to Moses and showing a reframing of a new way to follow him. Now, if you look at the top of your handout, you'll see the start of this translation before we get into the Beatitudes. And I do want to let you know we're going to be spending a significant amount of time on the Beatitudes today, in part because they are so foundational. But if you see even just this quick couple of sentences at the top, there's actually a lot that is being communicated in them that might not be readily apparent. So you have this phrase that when he went up the mountain, within the ancient world, and you see this throughout Scripture over and over, mountains were viewed as what we might describe as a thin place. In sort of the ancient cosmology, you were that much closer to heaven, that mountains are a place of theophany or appearances of God. And so the fact that this was being given on a mountaintop, again, sort of feeds into this understanding that this is divine revelation, that part of what is being communicated in this sermon is God's authoritative word. Now, I mentioned Moses already. Those familiar with Matthew's gospel will remember that there are these early allusions already, that you have Herod, much in the same way that Pharaoh sought to kill all infants 2 and under in Exodus, that you have that same dynamic going on in the early stages of Matthew's gospel, along with Jesus escaping from Egypt. It's very clear that Matthew is being intentional about setting Jesus and putting him into conversation with Moses. And that's something that will continue throughout much of Matthew's gospel. Another interesting part of this framing at the start is this phrase, after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Today, we might read that and just think it's a nice little transition sentence. But within the world of Judaism, and specifically Rabbinic Judaism, sitting and having people gather around you to sit down and to teach was an authoritative teaching. I don't know what it says about me that I'm standing and walking around. We'll leave that contrast aside. But sitting down is an important framing of all of this, that these are not just good words or wise words. This is an authoritative word from God. And I think that framing is really important as we start to get into the rest of the text. So one of the things that I really appreciate about the way that Barclay tries to help frame all of this is by noting that that this phrase is sacred and authoritative. But again, you have heard it said, but I say to you, there's this repeated refrain throughout much of the Sermon on the Mount, and we'll get into that even more in subsequent weeks, that what is going on is that Jesus is telling his disciples, anyone who would follow him, that what you are about to hear is a reframing of this law that has been handed down now for centuries. And it's so important to understand that in the wider context of his ministry and what he is coming to do. But interestingly, and I really appreciate this interpretation, there's this phrase, he taught them saying, that I'm not going to drag you down into the world of parsing out Greek, but the important part to recognize is that this is a teaching that was not delivered one time, but is a teaching that is ongoing. It was not just meant for those who were sitting on the mountain that morning. It was meant for all of us. This is Jesus' ongoing words to all of us. As Barclay says, it's the essence of all that Jesus continuously and habitually taught to his disciples. Now, it is hard to parse out, as I shared about Matthew combining all of these disparate traditions in Luke into one text. Was this verbatim a text that Jesus had shared before, a teaching that Jesus had shared before, or is this just a distillation of Jesus' teachings? For me, that question is interesting, but ultimately is not important. I believe that Jesus, as he traveled throughout his ministry, everything that you are about to hear in the Sermon on the Mount over these next 3 weeks are things that if he was sharing on the mountain, he would have been sharing in towns, in the countrysides. We often, when we read through the biblical text, just think about it as a narrative that just is very linear. We forget how much he must have been traveling around from place to place, delivering the same message, making sure that got out into the wider world. And so thinking about this as a distillation of Jesus' ongoing teachings, I think is a really helpful frame as we get into this. And speaking of framing, for me, as I shared at the start, this season of Lent that we are in asks questions of us and our discipleship and our following of Jesus. And I think that this returning to this sermon is so vital for this time. In this season of Lent, we ask ourselves, what does it mean to follow Christ, to follow Christ's way? We make the difficult leap into asking ourselves, in our most self-respective moments, where am I falling short of that holy calling? What might I need to turn away from, and what am I being called to turn towards? That's difficult work. That introspective work is not something that most of us come naturally to. And yet that is exactly what this season invites us to, and what I believe the Sermon on the Mount is inviting us to in our wider discipleship as well. I bolded this here because for me this is almost kind of the thesis of what we're going to be doing over these next 3 weeks. That the Sermon on the Mount helps us fundamentally understand what it means to follow Christ, and that this season of Lent that we are in is an opportunity to reorient our vision, thinking, and actions so that we might better live as one of Christ's disciples. Hopefully doing that sounds good to all of you. I'm going to do the best I can to live out everything that we're talking as well. But before we get into some of this background on the Beatitudes, I actually think I would like to ask us to pause real quick, and I invite you to hear these words from the Beatitudes once through. I invite you to close your eyes if you'd like, or you can read along if you'd like. But again, as I prayed, I hope that you will open your ears to hear them afresh in this time and to feel the power of them, because I really do believe that they have so much to teach us. So hear now these words from the 5th chapter of Matthew. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, For your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. These words are beautiful and powerful, regardless of whether you have a seminary degree or are digging into the Greek or just picked up a Bible and are reading through them. But the beauty of being able to study the biblical text and to dig a little bit into the language is that it can unlock new meanings as well, and including ways in which these can be reframing for us as well. So this repeated phrase that the word does come from this Latin, beatitudo, does mean blessed. But in the original Greek that Matthew would have been written in, it has a sense both of divine blessing, or sometimes you may have seen it translated as happy. Now, happy is a strange translation for us. We tend to think about happiness in a very particular way. But as Barclay goes on to explain, that root meaning, that Greek of happy, is that you can translate this as blessing, but really what it's saying is that there is an undamageable joy that is present. There is a joy that is independent of the chances and changes of life. That when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, it means that joyful are those in poor in spirit, nothing may be taken away from them. And we're going to get into what that means. It's a fascinating framing. But I really appreciate what Barclay underlines over and over again. You hear throughout these Beatitudes, they will be comforted, they will inherit the earth, they will be filled. So often when we hear these words, we tend to think about them as being accomplished in the future. Barclay underscores and emphasizes that these blessings, the actual word blessing, is not written in the future tense. It's written in the present. This is reality. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, and so on it goes. As he says, this is not pious hopes of what shall be. They are congratulations on what is. Now that's a challenging contrast, because I think a lot of us would look at that list and say, can we really describe joy for those who are mourning? What is Jesus communicating in this to us? And we're going to be unpacking a little bit about what that means as we get into each of these Beatitudes. But I'm going to share a couple of what I think are very interesting framing quotes, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. I want to try to pause for questions throughout this so that we don't just keep them all pent up till the end. So I'll start by saying, from the Reverend Kathy Escobar, it's so easy to think that money, power, or status will give us security and a stronger sense of self. And yet Jesus says it will be exactly the opposite. That to find our lives, we need to lose them, and we need to realize there's nowhere else to go but down. Down into the mess of real life, and down into the places where real people in need of God's hope live. And that's a really important thing that we're going to be returning to. And finally, from the wisdom of St. Francis of Assisi, let us consider what our vocation is. It's not only for our own salvation that God has called us by his mercy, but it's for the salvation of many others, more by example than words, to do penance and to keep the divine precepts. So we see in these quotes a desire for us to apply them directly to our life, not to be removed from it, but to be active and engaged in it. And I think for me, seeing these Beatitudes not as a call for what will be in the future, but as what we are meant to do and be creating in this present, is for me an essential part of what Jesus is trying to communicate to his disciples, both then and now as well. So before we get into the individual Beatitudes, I would welcome if anyone has questions. I see Sam all the way in the back.
If you have questions, wait for me to get the mic, otherwise people online cannot hear you.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. Thank you again for those online.
Matt, thank you for this. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. I appreciate the commentary that moves this into the present tense rather than a future promise, because one of the things that I have struggled with the Beatitudes is the transactional nature of them. Could you comment on that?
On the transactional?
Yes. Be a peacemaker, you will receive a reward. If you are meek, this will be your reward. If you are pure in heart or poor, this will be your reward if you just hang on. And so it's a sense of you will eventually be rewarded for what you are doing now. And it has always seemed like some kind of bargain that is
Yeah.
being made with God.
That is an incredibly helpful thing to note, and I really appreciate that, because what I hope is the exact opposite of that. We tend to, or we can read these absolutely as you know. I'm struggling for a better word than transactional, but I think you got it. I think what's really important is Jesus emphasizing that this present state where people are in, this blessing, that is something that we hold and can't be taken away from us or added to. Whatever it is, whether we are making peace, we do so because that is inherent to who we are as followers of Jesus, not in order to earn a reward. Same goes for all these others. It's not do X, therefore Y will happen. It is we are X, therefore we will do Y. I shouldn't be introducing math, but hopefully you understand hopefully you understand what I meant by that. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Catherine. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
I think my voice is pretty loud.
Well, we want those online to hear, but yes.
I just assume that the reward is the behavior itself. It's similar to what you said, how the behavior shapes me, because like you, I am very discouraged and disheartened by everything that's going on. And so to keep myself in a state where my behavior follows Christ's teachings as much as I can, that's my reward, the state of mind, the state of being.
I really appreciate that a lot, and I think you're very right to lift that up, that any time that we are holding to all of these blessings and trying to live them out in our lives, paradoxically, even though they may in many cases seem challenging, I think we ultimately find them to be their own reward. So I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. Yeah, Jude. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
What was your name? Sam. Thank you for that. I've never thought of this passage this way. Dietrich von Bonhoeffer in The Cost of Discipleship does a long explication of the sermon, and he talks about each of the words, poor in spirit, those who mourn, etc., and he talks about what it takes for us to be that, to be meek, the work that it takes for each of us to be meek. And if you look at it from that perspective, it's not that if kind of you are in the state of meekness, therefore you receive this reward. It's that we work toward being meek, and it's almost in doing that work, the rewards just come naturally. It's not sort of the transactional bargain that you're describing, but it's more an inevitable byproduct of the work we do in order to achieve that type of being. And I think that until I had read Bonhoeffer on that, I'd always thought, I'm not a meek person, so that I don't get that reward. And what he's saying is these are attributes that we need to work toward. Yeah. And I think it is probably a natural byproduct of doing that.
Absolutely.
work.
And meek's an interesting one that we're going to get into a little bit as well, because there's different ways to understand it. We'll take one more question, and then I do want to do some deep dive language into some of these as well.
Thank you. So is it only the merciful who will receive mercy, only the pure in heart who will see God?
I don't want to speak on behalf of God, but I will say I don't see the word only in it. I think it is a statement of truth while not being exclusionary, is what I would say. But I leave that to God alone. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start digging into some of these individual Beatitudes. I think there is going to be quite a bit that we can spend time chewing on, and I hope to kind of pause throughout this, because I think all of them have lessons to teach us as disciples. Certainly one that has been often remarked upon, and sort of the interesting contrast is this phrase, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, Barclay makes a note that there is a difference, different types of poverty within the word Greek. The one that is used is actually the lowest form of poverty, meaning destitute. It's not the working poor, it is those who truly do not have anything. But what's happening is that this word is actually connected to a Hebrew one that is about not putting our faith, our trust in material things, but that we put our trust entirely in God. Now that is a challenging thing in our world and culture. We put our trust entirely in God over material things. This phrase, poor in spirit, can be understood in a whole host of different ways. But this is one that Barclay underlines over and over. And he says that the poor in spirit are men and women who have realized that things mean nothing and that God means everything. But he also makes careful note to say that we don't try to glorify poverty. In fact, quite the opposite. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he was constantly speaking out against it. This beatitude is not calling actual material poverty a good thing. It is a bad thing. Instead, what it is trying to communicate to us is that part of what it means to a disciple is to put our trust into God over our possessions, our things, what we have. In this culture that we live in, that is a discordant message often. It can be an uncomfortable one for those of us who grew up, really emphasizing or having emphasized to us a need to be self-reliant or to make sure that you provide for yourself. But what this passage is saying is that to follow Christ, you put your trust in God. God means everything. Our things mean nothing. And that's a tough thing. I really appreciated these reflections as well from some the great spiritual authors, Philip Yancey, a current evangelical author, who writes that dependence, humility, simplicity, cooperation, and a sense of abandon are qualities that are greatly prized in the spiritual life, but are extremely elusive for people who live in comfort. That one stings a bit. I certainly see myself in all of that, so that the more we feel independent, the more we feel self-sufficient, the more removed we are from God and God's grace and God's mercy. That's a challenge. And he goes on to say, I now view the Beatitudes not as patronizing slogans, but as profound insights into the mystery of human existence. And then Dorothy Day has challenging words for us. Dorothy Day was a journalist and an author of the Catholic Worker, I believe. Dorothy Day writes to us, nowadays religious communities, and yes, sometimes the eye is going to be on us as well. We don't just look out in the world. Sometimes we have to stare at ourselves. In fact, usually we have to stare at ourselves first. Nowadays religious communities are good, I am sure, but they're mistaken about poverty. They accept and admit poverty on principle, but everything must be good and strong, and a community is always building, enlarging, and embellishing. There's nothing left over for the poor. We have no right to do so as long as there are slums and breadlines somewhere. Those are convicting words in particular for us as a church as well. I'm not going to solve that dichotomy at times, but it's part of Jesus' challenge to us, I think. Things mean nothing. God means everything. And how are we living that out? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. As with this last, with the poor in spirit, that poverty being destitute would be another translation. The word for mourning that is used, blessed are those who mourn, is the deepest sense of mourning in Greek. Pantheo, a lament, an intense mourning, a word that is used when someone has just lost someone beloved to them. Blessed are those who experience that level of intense mourning. Now, to say that they will be comforted, again, there's that strange dynamic where we say one day, I guess they will feel better. And yet we hear this is the present. Blessed are those who are experiencing mourning. Now, why is that? Barclay tries to unpack this in saying that sorrow can show us, as nothing else can, the essential kindness of others, and it can show us, as nothing else can, the comfort and compassion of God. For those of us in this room, and I imagine most, if not all of us, who have experienced losing someone dear to us, we have experienced or been the recipients of incredible acts of love and caring. This is not something that we would wish on anyone to experience, but that love, that deep sense of care, and at times we may be angry with God, but knowing when God's love surrounds us, that is one of the smallest windows that we have, one of the best windows we have into seeing God's love in full. It's important to recognize even amidst all that hurt. And he goes on to say that Christianity is caring. This beatitude is also challenging us to say, blessed are those who care intensely for those who are suffering. Part of what it means to be Christian, to follow Christ, is to live out that present tense, blessed are those who mourn. We are called to be blessings to those who are experiencing loss and mourning, while also recognizing and turning it to ourselves in the season of Lent sometime, recognizing that part of what we are mourning are our own shortcomings and failings. Psalm 51 is one that is often recited on Ash Wednesday at the start of Lent, this sort of turning back to God, a return. This sense of recognition of our own falling short, we still nonetheless believe that those who mourn are blessed by God, that God will continue to guide and inspire us in our present.
May I make a comment?
Sure, Anita, but we're going to make sure we get you a mic. Well, we need a mic, though. Okay.
Well, I think the blessing that we have when we're mourning is that we loved this person so much. That's a blessing, that we experienced that love.
Yeah. No, that intensity of feeling and that love is certainly powerful, and it's difficult in that moment to be grateful for it, and yet we know it is so much better to experience that level of connection and love. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we go on to be challenged with a few additional quotes. Who are the mourners? The mourners are those who have caught a glimpse of God's new day and who ache with all their being for that day's coming. Those who break out in tears when confronted with its absence. The mourners are aching visionaries. When I was describing earlier that sense of feeling like I was losing hope and losing a sense of direction, or feeling like what I had to offer isn't enough, this phrase, the mourners are aching visionaries, gave me a little bit of hope. It's a good thing to feel that way. It inspires us and pushes us forward. To be a visionary, to see the place where we want the world to be, and to mourn the places that it's not there, that's what it means to be a mourner. And that's a good thing. We are blessed to mourn, to look to the future, to be aching visionaries. I think it's a lovely reframing. And also from another author, Frederica Matthews Green, I believe an Orthodox writer, we are fully known that even in the depths of ourselves we cannot see or cannot bear to see. Instead of hoping God will love us for our good parts and pass over the rest, we know that he died for the bad parts and will not rest until they are made right. Beautiful words for this Lenten season, and certainly the promise of Easter makes all of that ring true. So I really appreciate these reframings of those who mourn. Now let's continue on. That word meek was invoked a little bit earlier, and this is a fun one to pick apart a little bit, because more than any of the others, this actually has a much different translation in Greek than it would in our English language. As it says, being meek is, for us, the picture of someone who is submissive or spineless and ineffective. But in Greek, it actually had a much different connotation. Aristotle defined it as a happy medium between too much and too little anger. Interesting. Being meek is not to just lay down. It's knowing when to be upset. Take, for example, Jesus overturning the money changers, or the tables of the money changers. And too little anger of just accepting the way that things are. Being meek is instead this happy medium in between those two things. And so Barclay offers this intriguing translation. Blessed are those who are always angry at the right time and are never angry at the wrong time. I don't know how many of us can live up to that. But man, what an intriguing and thoughtful idea. I love that. But he also goes on to note that this refers ultimately to humility as well, and that what we are seeking to do is not living out our own anger, but instead to be a follower. That meekness refers to our ability to follow God and God's will. That we are angry when God would be angry, things that would make God upset, rather than things that might just irk us. And so as he translates it, blessed are those who have the humility to know their own ignorance, weakness, and their own need. That's a difficult thing to come by. But may we all aspire to that. And Elizabeth Elliot, a writer, goes on to say, meekness is teachability, that we won't make it into the kingdom without that simple willingness to be taught and corrected and helped. Again, that ability to follow. Meekness is an explicitly spiritual quality, a fruit of the Spirit that is learned, not inherited. It shows in the kind of attention that we pay to one another, in the tone of voice we use, and in the facial expression. So again, it's that spirit that we have with one another that gets built on by one of the church fathers, John Chrysostom, renowned for his preaching, golden tongue, I believe, it's used in the history books. For what is more lovely than a mouth that knows not how to insult, but is used to bless and give good words? Reflecting then on these good things, become like him to the utmost of your power. So meekness, again, this walking this fine line between knowing when to be angry and when not to, according to God's will, something that probably lies outside the bounds of any of our ability, and yet we strive to do the best we can to follow. Being responsive to God, using the gifts that we have been given, the influence, the people that we are connected to, being able to build up and use that for the good. What a beautiful charge. Things that are building us up rather than tearing down. I think that is one of the great charges of the Sermon on the Mount, is asking us to help build God's kingdom, not to tear it down. And so often we fall into that latter category. And one more before we're going to take a quick break and a little summary, because I know it's hard to just go through 8 straight in a row. I apologize for that. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. As Barclay says, this beatitude is a challenge. How much do we want goodness? Do you want it as much as a starving person wants food, as much as someone dying of thirst wants water? How intense is our desire for goodness? That's a question we all have to ask ourselves. But in an added challenge, the Greek word that is used for righteousness, diakosune, dikaiosune. Sorry, I know someone out there is going to correct me, so I thought I'd preemptively do it. So, all right. So this word is written in a particular tense in Greek. Greek is very complicated. There's lots of tenses. But one of the things to know about this is that what this word for righteousness means is that it is referring to the whole, all of righteousness, and not just our little particular slice of the pie. We are not hungering and thirsting for righteousness for ourselves or some people. It is righteousness for all. And we're going to get into that a little bit later with peacemakers as well. There's a call for us to expand our understanding of who is included in God's righteousness. It's not partial goodness. It is a goodness that is total and whole. And that is what we are called to hunger and thirst for in this world. And interestingly, I did not realize this until I was looking through Following the Call. The entire section of Following the Call's, usually they weave together about 4 or 5 different authors. The entire section was only from this William Barclay book, so we're being quoted from that. Barclay lays out, this beatitude lays down the main cause of failure in the Christian life. That cause of failure is simply that we do not sufficiently desire to be a Christian. And that great barrier is our deep-rooted unwillingness to pay the price of it, the price of discipleship from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Our fundamental desire is to not upset life, but to keep it as it is. A temptation that I'm going to editorialize is particularly tempting for those of us who live very stable lives, have the ability to make choices in our lives, or to have that sort of level of safety. When we experience that type of life, many of us desire to keep it as it is, and yet Christ is calling us and pushing us to go a little further. And then Barclay also notes that Luke offers a different version of this beatitude. Luke, if you've read through before, gets some woe statements attached to instead of just blessings. So for those who need a little fire lit under them, you can turn to Luke as well. Woe unto you who are full, for you shall hunger. That means woe to you who are satisfied and who are content with the way things are. You may live comfortably now, but the day comes when you will discover that you have somehow missed the greatest things of all. We're going right back to that start, that our relationship with God, our trust in God is first, our relationship with the things we have is last. We're going right back to that. So a quick summary of where we have been before we get into the final four. Part of what it means to follow Christ, our challenge to follow Christ, is that we trust in God over the allure of what material things like wealth or possessions or property can give us. That in humility we recognize that we are ultimately reliant on God, and that we hold an ache within us for those who are suffering and also at our own shortcomings. And yet even in our imperfection, we aspire to live lives that are gentle in our treatment of others and yet forceful in holding fast to what is good. And when we encounter places in our lives that are at odds with what Christ teaches us, that we have the bravery to seek transformation. These first four of the Beatitudes, I think, really help to underscore and emphasize these things as a foundational part of what it means to be a disciple. It calls us in many ways to change our vision from the wider culture. It calls us to change our actions in how we live out our lives. But it also asks us to consider, even from the most basics, of how we interact with our neighbor or who we consider our neighbor. All of these sorts of things. It continues to poke and prod us to follow ever closer in Jesus' way. So before turning to these final four, I want to open up again. Sorry, Justin, I'm putting you on the move today. So any questions, or I suppose we can welcome comments before we get into the home stretch.
Thank you for this. This ancient Greek and everything is really great to have this context. But I have to say, these scare me because I'm thinking, okay, it's Lent.
That's good. You're taking it seriously, is what I would
Are
say.
I guess I feel the way Benjamin Franklin did when his autobiography, he tried to be perfect and he kept saying, I'm working on this and I've hit this one, but then I've overdosed on that one. So if we're going to do this as a spiritual practice, do we do all of them at once? Do we pick? No, this is a serious question.
I really appreciate the question.
Do you pick
yes.
one that really resonates with you and say, okay, I'm going to work this one to the max during Lent? Would you suggest maybe doing one a week? Ever since I was a little kid, I felt overwhelmed by the Beatitudes. And I'm really appreciating this, but I still need a little guidance.
No,
Thank you.
I really appreciate that question. I think it's very wise because it is easy to be overwhelmed. And I think any honest reading, no matter who is reading it, you walk away from it saying, I am not doing enough. and I think one of the things I would hope you take away is I don't want us to sit in that guilt or feelings of shame, because I don't think that's what Jesus is trying to tell us. I think the urgency of doing our best to live these things out is what I hope that we're walking away with rather than guilt. In terms of practical, if you were even one Lenten season to focus on one of these and try to live that out however you may, I think that is a beautiful and faithful way to approach the Lenten season. If you feel like you have the capacity to do more, great. No? Okay. But I think part of why we observe the season of Lent every year is both starting with a honest confession that none of us are doing this perfectly, but that we're striving to walk ever closer in God's way. And so any steps that you take on that journey are positive steps. And I think that's a good thing. So I'm right there with you. I appreciate the reading because it is daunting, to say the least. Any other questions? All right. Sure, I'll move the mic to you. I got it, Justin.
I don't know how to say this, but it seems, and I've had some experiences in my life that were amazing, is the focus really needs to be on God, not on us. And I'll also share this, which I didn't know I was going to do. When I went to the Dome of the Rock, and I was by myself, and I wanted to go up and get a Quran, and the soldiers weren't going to let me go up. And I just held, this is what I'm talking about, the loving. I just held in the loving. And one soldier would get one higher up and talk to me, and I said, I came all the way from Chicago, and this is where I want to be. I have to be here. And then I went up like 5 different levels, and they finally said, get up there. So I think it's really the love that is the cure of everything.
I do believe that, absolutely. Love is a cure for everything, and it sounds like persistence is part of this Lenten season as well. So I think that's a good message. All right. Well, we'll continue on with our final 4 of the Beatitudes, although I should note, and we'll touch on this in the last one, there are some who claim this is a list of 9 and some that claim it's a list of 8. I'm one of the 8 people, so I'll just throw cards on the table, but we'll get there. So for number 5 on this list of blessings, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. For those who have heard preachers quote this over the years, not the Eliaman part, but the Hebrew word hesed, a word that in Hebrew is a mixture of loving and kindness and faithfulness all wrapped up into one word. There's not a good word for it in English, but loving and faithfulness and kindness. Blessed are those, you could read it in that way, who have that level of faithfulness to one another, and that mercy and forgiveness is woven into that as well. As Barclay translates, it's the ability to get right inside other people until we can see things through their eyes, to think things with their minds, and to feel things with their feelings. That level of closeness, the old phrase, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, it is that level of mercy and connection, to be connected to another person, to forgive them in those times when they cause offense. Interestingly, he quotes, and I've actually been chewing on this one all week, and I don't know if I believe it, but I like the concept of it, that to know all is to forgive all. Your mileage may vary on that, but I think it's an intriguing idea that I quite literally have been thinking about all week. To know all is to forgive all. But he connects this to, we will never know all until we make a deliberate attempt to get inside to another person's heart and mind. That is just what God did. God came to us not as a remote or detached or isolated, majestic God, but as a man, as a person. The supreme instance of God's hesed, God's loving kindness and faithfulness, was the coming of God in Jesus Christ, the incarnation. That is such a wonderful framing to know that Christ experienced humanity in the way that all of us do. That closeness of God to us, knowing that when he cries out from the cross, Father, forgive them, we know how true that is. What a remarkable thing. So we go on to expand on this idea of mercy. Charles Moore, I think, the editor of this book, talks about the posture of being mercy. That being merciful is not just doing kind deeds, it assumes a certain posture. The merciful know what it means to need mercy, and that's why they can't help but respond to the guilt and suffering of others. They, like Jesus, are moved with compassion to all of those who have lost the way. Having that true sense of sympathy, not seeing this as merely about what we do, to me, that's a really potent and powerful thing. For all of us have lost the way. And I also really appreciated the Russian author Leo Tolstoy's vision of this, that we really bring to life on Christmas Eve. That's all I could think about as I read this. But as one candle kindles another and thousands are lit from that one, so also one heart inflames another and thousands are set a-glowing. If only the love is multiplied, the miracle is accomplished which was performed at the distribution of the 5 loaves. All are satisfied, and much still yet remains. Living a life of grace and mercy, especially in the face of, it is so easy to respond with hate or anger when that's what we're receiving. But to respond with kindness, with love, I love this vision and the ripple effects of our posture of mercy, of loving kindness, of faithfulness, can have a farther impact than I think any of us even realize. Going on to, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. This one is one of self-examination. It uses and gets into this word cardia, which we all know for heart. This is looking at our inner life. And it asks us, it challenges us to say, is what we do from selfless motives or from motives of self-display? To examine one's motives is a daunting and shaming thing, for there are few things in this world that even the best of us do with unmixed motives. How true. How true. And yet, being that pure in heart, seeking to follow God first, not applause. It's a temptation for every preacher. It's a temptation for all of us. Follow God first, not applause or praise. It's a challenging thing, but something that Jesus calls all of his disciples to. Thomas Merton was someone who I think lived that out well. He writes, the man of simple intention, and I'll say the person of simple intention, I'll expand on his language. Person of simple intention works in an atmosphere of prayer, that is to say, they are recollected. Their spiritual reserves are not poured out into their work, but stored where they belong, in the depths of their being with their God. They are detached from the work and from its results. Only a person who works purely for God can at the same time do a very good job and leave the results of the job to God alone. It's an interesting charge for all of us in whatever it is that we do, whether that is here in church or out in our lives, to do the best that we can, but to recognize and to try to decenter ourselves and instead to center around what God is asking us to do. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's what we're asked. And Brennan Manning writes that holiness is not a personal achievement, and I would say it's also not something you ever fully complete. Instead, it's an emptiness that you discover in yourself, and instead of resenting it, you accept it, and it becomes a free space where the Lord can create anew. That's the work that we are doing in this Lenten season, is creating this, they're cultivating this sense of recognition that we are trying to put God first above ourselves, difficult as that is. Now going on, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Whenever most of us hear this, I think our automatic assumption is that it refers to being people who push back against war and violence. And that is a piece of this, absolutely. But this is another one where the Hebrew behind this, shalom, which many of you will be familiar with, actually brings a whole lot of other great senses into the fold as well. Shalom, peace, is not just the absence of war and violence. Shalom, again, goes back to this word wholeness. That shalom, true shalom, is wholeness and wellness for all people. It's not just the absence of violence and war. It is wellness and wholeness for all people. And being a peacemaker, a maker of wellness in our world, means that we are doing the best that we can to create places, spaces, to lift people up when they need that, to walk alongside people in difficult times. This is what it means to be a peacemaker, is not just speaking out against war and violence, although those things certainly do harm others, but it's seeking wholeness and wellness in our world in many forms. And as Barclay notes, that the rabbis held that the highest task that anyone can perform is establishing right relationships with other people. To love God, love neighbor as yourself, I'll toss in there. What a beautiful vision of what it means to be a peacemaker. It's not just about speaking out against war, but about creating true shalom out in our communities, whether this city or beyond. The peace activist John Deere writes that as peacemakers, we begin with nonviolence to ourselves, nonviolence to all others and all creatures and all creation, and working publicly for a new world of nonviolence. We're peaceful towards ourselves and steadfastly cultivate inner peace. We do our part to make a more peaceful world, and that inner peace is essential as a grounding for all of the work that we are called to do. Merton does that same twist, beginning rather than outward, looking inward. Instead of loving what you think is peace, love other people and love God above all. And instead of hating the people you think are war makers, hate the appetites and disorder in your own soul, which are the causes of war. If you love peace, then hate injustice, hate tyranny, hate greed. But hate these things in yourself first, not in another. Don't look at the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own. We'll get to that one soon enough. These are challenging words at a time when I know there is a posture of violence and strength and many who are beating the drums of war in our world. We are called to cultivate an inner peace and to let that peace radiate out from us like candles, being advocates for it in our communities, being advocates for wellness. Blessed are the peacemakers. And finally, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For the early hearers of this gospel, this would have meant something very particular to them. Many of them would have experienced persecution in ways that we here in the United States do not have to worry about. But in other parts of the globe, certainly experience this still today as a very real thing. But there are times when our views come into conflict with whether it be our work lives, our social lives, or familial lives. There are places, even if not persecution, that we and our faith will come into conflict with values that we might see. As Barclay notes, the great ground of persecution is political. Oh, this is going in a different direction. I apologize. But I will come back to this Barclay quote. So the great ground of persecution was political, that there is one person who personified the empire, and that was the emperor, and so the emperor became to be regarded as a god. And so when I have a meeting in 15 minutes if anyone wants to join. Good to know. Confronted with the choice, Caesar or Christ, that those earliest Christians, and the challenges to us today, uncompromisingly chose Christ. When we are confronted with Caesar or Christ, put in the language of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that sort of nationalism and that movement versus our allegiance to Christ, the earliest disciples chose Christ. We are called to do the same. And as Barclay goes on to say, where there is good that the church must praise, where there is evil the church must condemn, that there will be times when that puts us into odds about what is going on in our wider world, whether it is the political moment that we are in or otherwise. The words of the Sermon on the Mount are bigger than any one political moment. It is a call and a response to always be on the side of those who are being persecuted, those who are vulnerable in our midst, and that we work alongside anyone who is working for those things of good, but that where there is evil in this world, that we are compelled to condemn them, regardless of consequence to us. Someone who experienced that very much firsthand, one of the 20th century martyrs, someone who died for his faith and his protection of others, was Oscar Romero, who wrote that a church that does not provoke crisis, a gospel that does not disturb, a word of God that does not rankle, a word of God that does not touch the concrete sin of the society in which it is being proclaimed, what kind of gospel is that? Dear brothers, do not betray your service to this ministry of God's word. It is very easy to be servants of the word without disturbing the world in any way. Oof, challenging, truly challenging. And then finally, I'll leave you with this quote from Jean Dessalles. The confrontation was not very popular in first century Palestine. It's not popular anywhere today. To bring gospel values to bear on labor practices, governmental decisions, or even religious traditions and policies is no more popular for a follower of Jesus than it was for him. This challenge is eternal for us as the church. This tension between what Christ calls us to do and how we are called to interact with the world around us. There will be times when it may have consequence for us. Those consequences can vary. We by and large, do not live in a society where we live under any real threat of persecution in the way that the early church did, though I want to specify that those around the globe, Christians around the globe, may be in situations where that is the case today. But even at the expense of some of the smaller things in life, we are called always to put God and our allegiance to God's word first, and everything else follows from there. That is a challenge that will continue to exist within us, and is a challenge that we are going to continue return to as we move forward in this series, as Christ continues to provide such a ambitious look at what we are called to do as Christians that it makes all of us uncomfortable. But that uncomfortability, that sort of ramping up the stakes, is a key part of what Christ is trying to communicate to us. The urgency of living out these Beatitudes, of living out this gospel message. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus, you are called to follow him, come what may. So, in summary, and I know I have this meeting in 10 minutes, so we'll go from there. What does it mean to follow Christ? That we deliberately attempt to see the world through other people's eyes, being slow to judgment, quick to offer mercy and forgiveness. That we endeavor to center God's way above our own, avoiding our self-righteousness or self-satisfaction. We cultivate peace and wholeness within our hearts and foster peace and wholeness in the world around us. And we recognize that there are times when following Christ will put us at odds with the world around us, often with negative consequences, and yet we are resolved to follow Christ still. May that be so for all of us, and with our last little bit of time, I would invite any questions before we conclude. All right, or go with that. Anyone? All right. I see no hands, so I'll just say, thank you all. I know this was very focused on the Beatitudes this week. We'll cover much more ground as we get into the next 2 weeks. These are just so foundational, it felt important to dwell on them. But looking forward to covering the rest of the Sermon on the Mount with you soon. So thank you all.